Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. So, yeah, I'm a professor from the University of York, and I'm also a research professor at the University of Oslo since last year. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Beata in particular for her diligent work on this project for the last 4 years. The draft report is actually finished, but it's still subject to a few amendments, but the final report should be out next week. The draft report runs to some 85 pages, and I've got 10 minutes. So I'm going to miss some details potentially, and I'm not going to talk about everything that we recommend in the report, but just concentrate on some broad themes. So let me begin by saying that it's undeniable that there has been progress in this field, in the field of finance. The European Commission and other bodies have engaged in extensive and in some cases very far-reaching reforms. It's been a little bit frustrating in some ways, because when we started this project in 2016, obviously the genesis of this project was slightly before that, but in 2016 most of these initiatives had not even been, they may have been talked about but hadn't been suggested. So I suppose the point being is that a lot of what the EU has done already is good. We have had to adapt our recommendations based upon the fact that a lot of what we would have recommended when the project started has now been implemented since. On the other hand, I do think that there are flaws in the various programs. The EU Sustainable Finance Initiative, of course, has garnered an awful lot of attention, an awful lot of press. We've got the EU Green Deal announced towards the end of last year, but that itself has come under sustained criticism for the amount of additional and new financing available to support the transition to a sustainable financial setting. The EU, of course, that has already been mentioned, misses some of the planetary boundaries and the social factors that the SMART project was also concerned with. And that, of course, is a key takeaway, hopefully, from the project as a whole, but also applies to finance. Most of these initiatives concentrate on climate change, which is, of course, de rigueur in policy circles, in national politics, the press, etc. And I think that that might, of course, limit the impact of those reforms on moving the sustainability debate forward. On the Sustainable Finance Initiative and associated programs themselves, again, I believe that there are some issues. It seems to disregard the fact that climate change and other unsustainable practices which are permitted and facilitated by financial markets are actually acute market failures. And if the market cannot solve those issues on its own, it will require some more far-reaching reforms than we've already encountered. The Green Deal, again, lauded recently by politicians, regulators, pressure groups and others. You know, yeah, it sounds great on paper, but how much new capital is actually being generated by institutions to support that programme? I read today, and I've read statistics confirming over the last few days that only 7.5 billion euros is actually new money. And that's over 7 years. €1 billion a year over 7 years of new investment is not going to push the reforms that are required in any meaningful way. Now, that of course comes as a function of the way the European Union is set up. So many of the reforms that I would have liked to have made in this field are much, I wouldn't say less radical, but you have to consider the political economy dimensions of these problems. And short of ripping up the Growth and Stability Pact or completely obliterating the ECB mandate, for example, we have to work within existing rules and structures to be realistic. So the sort of key point I want to make in the introduction is that the market, based upon the EU's political and economic philosophy, the market will not solve these problems. Okay? But, on the other hand, the public sector or public finances will not be mobilised in sufficient volumes to address the problems either. For various reasons, we hopefully most people in this room know the problems about getting investors to think about issues beyond their bottom line, about investment horizons, and about the fact that there seems to be a belief in EU policy circles that there is all of this untapped capital, that if we standardise everything and improve information flows to markets, that all of a sudden we will have a rush to investment in these products. And then that will slowly eliminate investments in non-sustainable assets or products. I do not buy into that one bit. I don't think that you can break this down to an information problem, and therefore by standardising information, making it more comparable, etc., you're suddenly going to have an influx into investment of into these sustainable projects. You know, Davos 2020 was remarkable in many ways. You had on the one hand Greta Thunberg, or Thunberg, I'm sorry I didn't pronounce that correctly, if I didn't. On the other hand we had Donald Trump. Completely different opposite ends of the spectrum. But the point was, bankers pushed back against most of these mooted reforms, despite in many instances publicly supporting efforts to mitigate climate change. Citibank stated, "We aren't the ones to define standards in an industry." Goldman Sachs, the bête noire of financial markets, their people said, if you are looking for a line, there's not a line. Should we not raise money for a company that is a carbon company or a fossil fuel company? The answer is no. We are not going to stop doing that. That means even if you have fairly amenable actors in financial markets, without being pushed in some way, they won't take decisions that reflect sustainability unless it improves their bottom line. And to me, the research on this ESG investment, delivers superior returns, is shaky, for a start. I'm not saying it's not true, but it's shaky. We also have some statistics on the amount that banks continue to lend into fossil fuels and other unsustainable activities. The banks in blue are those headquartered in the EU or in EFTA. Unfortunately, some of those banks will be removed at some point because they're headquartered in the UK, and therefore European regulations will no longer apply to them in the absence of some kind of trade deal. I won't say any more on that, other than to say I might move to Europe if I can. So we have to work within the existing paradigm. The market won't do anything, won't not do anything, but it's going to be difficult for the market to mobilise resources in the required volumes. So, on the other hand, the institutional structures of the European Union are so ingrained and actually fundamental to its structure and existence. If you think about the ECB mandate, for example, it's focused entirely on price stability. There's a review going on at the moment and Christine Lagarde has pushed for the inclusion of alternative considerations, climate change especially, in the review of the mandate, but it doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere. So we have to work within the confines of the EU treaties. Article 11 could give us some leeway, and that's sort of the tool that I would suggest that we revisit the ways in which sustainability can be incorporated into financial regulation. I'll have to go a bit more quickly because I don't have that much time. So bank capital then, how do we stop, instead of incentivising green lending, which for the reasons I've touched upon earlier, I don't think will work in any significant volume. How do we stop financing of particular activities? One way is to change the bank capital rules to disincentivise brown lending. That will require a brown taxonomy or some other standard of what constitutes a brown asset, and that's another recommendation that we make in the report, the introduction of a brown taxonomy to go with the green taxonomy that you're probably familiar with. The European Banking Authority at this time is launching a review of its sustainable finance guidelines. So that's the first thing. There's research to suggest that a brown asset penalising factor could reduce volumes significantly in terms of lending to these specific and unsustainable projects. The alternative, i.e. supporting green lending, the research suggests will have a negligible effect. And there's actually an experiment gone on with this, which is the SME supporting factor under the Capital Requirements Directive, which has had virtually no effect whatsoever. We can also talk about the central bank's powers, which can disincentivise the use or the issuance of brown assets, because the central bank can alter its collateral framework to penalise brown assets used for liquidity refinancing operations. There are many different programs that this can be achieved under. The increasing haircuts on brown assets when they're pledged for liquidity. And the ECB is already one of the most heavily concentrated central banks in terms of its monetary policy operations in bank loans. Most other central banks, when they offer refinancing, don't take corporate loans. The Federal Reserve doesn't take corporate loans. The ECB's balance sheet has 23% corporate loans as collateral. That's the size of the ECB central bank's balance sheet at the moment. 23% of that is loans to the corporate sector, or loans from the corporate sector pledged as collateral assets. So that's a route that we can take within the existing paradigm. We need to broaden and change the taxonomy under the Sustainable Finance Initiative. The Sustainable Finance Initiative's taxonomy for green investments is a great step forward. If you read the reports, they are voluminous, detailed, etc. Extremely impressive. But Why can we not have the same for brown assets? Why can we not have the same debate? And that itself would link to other financial regulations which we've talked about, especially capital requirements for banks. Broaden the taxonomy to banks. Again, I won't go into any detail on this, but at the moment the existing taxonomy does not apply to bank lending. Okay? Why not? I don't know. But there are voluntary initiatives being drawn up by the European Banking Federation. Why are they not mandatory? And finally, I'll wrap up by talking about sustainability disclosures. Okay, we've had regulations on this in 2019 about how investment firms, when they market products, have to include a sustainability assessment in their marketing to investors. The same does not apply to banks. And what proportion of bank financed credit or investment in the EU are we talking about? Well, bank loans provide around 70% of EU finance to SMEs and to corporates, large corporates, I mean. Why is this applied to banks, these guidelines? So, mandatory sustainability disclosures. We already have, well, we have voluntary sustainability disclosures in relation to climate change through the TCFD. We recommend that they be made mandatory, but on top of that, and more importantly, we argue that certain loans from banks to fund infrastructure of a certain size at least, we talk about 10 million euros or above, banks should be forced to conduct a sustainability assessment encapsulating all of the different factors that the SMART project has analysed. And, well, there you go. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. Okay, we're running out short of time.